I'm going to start off just talking about what nematodes are and how they impact soybean yields. So just getting into it, we're going to talk about what soybeans do to impact soybean yields. And really where we start off with is that they impact water and nutrient uptake by feeding on roots and root tissues. So the nematode we really talk about is soybean cyst nematode, and this is the #1 disease of soybeans in the United States and Canada. And this soybean nematode originated in the native growing soybean regions of Asia. This nematode is linked to soil movement in the US, and it's actually very well established in the US soy producing states. In Missouri and a lot of other Midwest states, it has been spreading since about the early 1970s, as you can kind of see from the movement that is depicted on the map on the right. So since its introduction in 1954, it has spread throughout most counties where soybean is produced. Some of what you're looking for when you're looking for symptoms and signs of soybean cyst nematode in your field really starts off with looking for stunted plants, which includes yellowing, shorter plants, the stunting symptoms, and often this will occur in patches because it'll be where the lower spots in the field where water has moved or accumulated. Sometimes you will see no symptoms associated with soybean cyst nematode, and they will be green, healthy looking plants, but you will see some lower yielding areas. Those are areas that can be associated with soybean cyst nematode as well. Other things that you will be looking for to find soybean cyst nematode are the signs, which will be the females that are on the roots, which are shown on the right. The white arrows are pointing to the white to tan colored females that you can see on the roots. And those will be found about 30 days after planting at the earliest. And those are actually feeding on those root tissues. Also, if you take a soil test, you can find eggs or cysts in the soil. So those are some of the signs and symptoms of soybean cyst nematode in a field. Now, when we really think about the life phases of soybean cyst nematode and how that impacts yield over time, we really think about the number of generations that we find of soybean cyst nematode in a season. So there's about 24 to 28 days for one life cycle to be completed of soybean cyst nematode. That means each season there are 3 to 6 generations of soybean cyst nematode that can happen in a single field. Inside each of those females, there are about 200 eggs. And the other thing is that each of those eggs can survive inside the dead females or cysts for 10 or more years in the soil. So that makes managing this pest very complicated. Multiple generations in a season, long-term survival of the eggs in the soil. So just to depict this in a picture, why do you need to soil sample? Why do you need to test your fields? How does this really impact yield over time? In a single season, if you start off with just 200 eggs and 100 of those are female, and only 3 generations of soybean cyst nematode happen in one season, by the end of the season, assuming that 99% of the females will die, you are still left with 39,000 eggs at the end of the season. There's an exponential rate of increase that soybean cyst nematode can have in a single season in a single field. So when you're thinking about soybean cyst nematode sampling also, you really need to think about how SCN moves. It doesn't just walk its way into a field. It has to move on different forms of equipment, on soil, in water, or on the wind. Another thing to keep in mind is just because you have an egg count of 0 does not necessarily mean that you don't have soybean cyst nematode. And this is shown in the picture on the right. If you're taking a soil probe, putting it into the soil, and taking a soil sample, sometimes you will capture the 7 cysts in picture A, and you will get an egg count as a result of capturing those 7 cysts. If you do not capture those 7 cysts, you will get a 0 egg count. So it's important to understand just because one SCN egg count comes back as 0 does not necessarily mean you don't have soybean cyst nematode. And the final thing to remember about a soil test is that soybean cyst nematode can reproduce on resistant soybeans. So then that brings me to resistant varieties. The target of resistance is to kill the feeding site of the soybean cyst nematode. So that source that is feeding on all of those nutrients that are allowing the beans to be able to produce lots of pods, lots of yield at the end of the season, right? And so what happens is resistant soybeans result in a programmed cell death of the syncytia, or the feeding site. And so what happens is it will starve the developing juveniles. However, a resistant soybean really is defined as a variety that has less than 10% reproduction of a soybean cyst nematode population as compared to susceptible check. So that means that there is still soybean cyst nematodes that reproduce on a resistant variety, just less than a susceptible variety. So what has happened over time is what we're seeing is about 95% of varieties have the same source of resistance to soybean cyst nematode. So soybean cyst nematode populations in most fields are adapting to this same source of resistance. And Missouri has won the race to 100% of populations that have been sampled recently to be resistant to the current source of resistance. Now, that does not mean that resistance is entirely failing. What we have found is that all resistant varieties do not perform equally. So if you can look at the image depicted on the right, the highest yielding varieties in this particular trial do not necessarily have the lowest levels of SCN reproduction. Some of the lower yielding varieties in this image have lower levels of SCN reproduction. And what we have found is that the higher level of soybean cyst nematode reproduction, so that is the number of females at the end of the season divided by the number of females at the beginning of the season. So you take a soil test at the end, and you have taken a soil test at the beginning, and you divide those numbers. You find that over time, the larger the number of reproduction, the lower the yields become. So what are we facing when it comes to resistance? We have some challenges. First of all, it is very obvious that there are very few sources of SCN resistance currently available. So right now, we manage soybean cyst nematode with resistance, and we manage soybean cyst nematode with crop rotation. We're looking at increased virulence, so a lot more reproduction of soybean cyst nematode on some varieties that have the 88788 source of resistance. But we are also seeing that there are some new varieties that are coming to market with other sources of resistance, the 89772 source of resistance in some areas, and there's also research being done for novel sources of resistance. And I've also mentioned that crop rotation is a huge part of soybean cyst nematode management because it can help to reduce the initial population that you're dealing with of soybean cyst nematode in a field. Because a single year of a non-host can help to reduce soybean cyst nematode counts by a small percentage. Soybean cyst nematode numbers do not necessarily increase after a year of a non-host crop, but they can increase even on a resistant variety. So it's much easier to keep those soybean cyst nematode counts low in the first place. So I've mentioned the first two parts of a soybean cyst nematode management plan with Step 0 being take a soil test to know your numbers in the first place. Then selecting resistant varieties, rotating your resistant sources to manage populations, even rotating within a resistant source to manage the populations you have, because reproduction differs even amongst varieties within a resistant source. Manage with crop rotation and weed management. And then the next step is look at some seed treatments that are currently available on the market to be able to add to that toolkit that is available.